Perfect. Okay. So today's program is going to be recorded, and I know last month we had some errors that had an issue with me being able to upload the videos, but nonetheless, we'll have this recorded. We'll try to make sure that we get posted up onto our online YouTube page so you can come back and watch it another time. As well as, again, if you all have any questions, feel free to ask. And as well online, if you have any questions, feel free to put those in the chat box. So let's go ahead and let's see if we can cut some lights because the photos are important. Switch them. Do the other one. Yeah. Back here. Is there only one switch?
There's only one switch here.
Does anybody see any other switches?
Oh, much better.
Perfect. All right. And I'm not a silhouette on here. The screen illuminates me enough. All right. So, well, anyway, so let's go ahead and jump into it. So let's talk about the unseen landscape. And again, my name is Dr. Taylor Clem. I'm the Horticulture Extension Agent, Master Gardener Volunteer Coordinator with IFAS Extension Nassau County. And this is the monthly Landscape Matters program. So it is a public education outreach program that the Master Gardener volunteers help coordinate and put on for the community. And this year, we're actually rotating in between the Fernandina Branch Library, our office in Yulee on Minor Road, and the library in Hilliard. So we're actually rotating around this year to kind of see how it does with different audiences. But as well, at any time, you can always register and get an online link. So if you were on a trip in Portugal and wanted to tune in, you totally could. Now, if you're in Portugal, I don't blame you for not wanting to sign in. But anyways, so let's go ahead and let's jump into the program. So the unseen landscape. So when you look at this photo, what is it a photo of? Yeah. And in the chat box, what do you see? What is this a photo of?
A savanna.
A savanna. I heard zebras of Africa. Yeah. What is the first thing that you all saw when you first saw this photo?
Trees, sky.
Trees, sky.
An open landscape.
Yeah, trees, absolutely. Sky, open landscape, the different colors. Perfect. There's a reason why I ask these questions. We'll get into it in a few. But just think about it. It's like, what is this a photo of? You know, there's a lot of things that we do when we look at landscapes and we interpret them. We don't always interpret them the same, and nor do we always look at them the same way. So, but it's relevant to today's discussion. Because now I start to think about this. Okay, when someone online put open space, openness. That's a good one. Yeah. So when you think about gardening history and landscape design, just from what you understand or know, what do you think about? How did it evolve? Like that's a nice ass house, but nonetheless, when you look at this, you know, a lot of homes, we see this type of landscape. You have a house, you have foundation plants, you have some trees. So what are your thoughts? When you think about gardening, history, and landscape design, what do you think about? How did it get to this point?
Jefferson and Washington, and how interested they were in building this type of
Landscape. Yeah. So Thomas Jefferson, and George Washington actually had a huge influence on the American landscape. Yeah, we'll actually talk about that a little bit too, briefly, if we have time. I put this together. I was like, this could be a two-part program, but yeah. What else do you all think about?
Going from a survival mentality to a presentation mentality.
Survival mentality to presentation mentality. Right on the nose. So right on the nose. So honestly, a lot of our landscapes, believe it or not, is biological. It's a biological response to our environment. And really, when we think about how do landscapes evolve, I always think of Maslow's hierarchy of needs. So here we are. Have any of y'all seen this before? Consider the basics. If you want to reach self-actualization, you know, this is not what you typically think about with landscapes, but that ultimate desire to become the most that you can be, in order to get there, you have to achieve everything else at the bottom, starting with safety needs and psychological needs. You cannot have that esteem or self-actualization unless you're meeting psychological safety, love and belonging, etc. So usually when we think about landscapes now, that presentation, it really comes down to esteem, a social thing. So it could kind of find that love and belonging as well, depending. But this is usually kind of like where maybe landscapes can kind of fall into. But when we think about the history of landscapes and how we interact with our environment, it's rooted in a biological nature, who we are. So it actually really comes down to meeting those safety and psychological needs of a landscape. So when we start thinking about, okay, how far back, Taylor, do we go? We go way back. Early human ancestors, as simple as this, cavemen, or early human, not necessarily cavemen, but the Paleolithic era before we were wanderers, kind of hunters, gatherers. And this is a great example of a landscape, thinking about how our landscapes exist. Where are they in this image? A cave, right? A place of protection, a place that then they can see outwards and see what's happening on the horizon. Yeah?
They're deciding what to do with their landscape.
Yeah, they're trying to figure out to do a landscape. Do they want to put a bed of roses down there? From the dawn of man. It's was it a space odyssey? Yeah, in a space odyssey, it's not an obelisk that comes down, it's a shovel. Yeah. But but really when we start thinking about landscapes, there's a biological response to it, but there's more to it than just that. So when we start thinking about the unseen landscape, I want us to paint that picture from a historic perspective. So when we look at the history of the garden world, not to be confused with Mel Brooks's History of the World, Part 1 and 2. But anyways, we have all these different ages that we can kind of loosely look at. I mean, it's world history in 7 little numbers. Yeah, right. So, but we can actually follow trends that existed in how landscapes have changed in time, and yet the same characteristics still exist at the basic level. So let's talk about landscapes. So we're going to talk about a couple theories, and it's actually things that people research to understand. It's like, why do we like the things that we like? So generally, we talk about landscape preferences and perceptions. Anybody know where this is? Central Park. Yeah. So this is Central Park. This is the Great Meadow of Central Park. I put this in here for a reason. Looks similar to the first photo you saw, kind of. An openness. There's trees, there's cover. There's a reason why we like that. If you were standing and you took this photo, where would you want to go? What would you want to do? Where would you go from here in this landscape?
In the shade. Picnic. Yeah.
Picnic, get in the shade. Yeah, picnic would be nice. Especially like on those mid-spring days up at northeast when it's like, oh, sun, it's probably 60 degrees outside, but there's sun, enjoy it. But anyway, so we always talk about generally landscape preference and perception. So understanding what preference and perception is, landscape preference is how and why people prefer some environments or landscapes to others, right? And perceptions is like, how do we understand them? So it's a little bit different. It's like, I like something, so what? What does it mean? What's an underlying characteristics that really allow me to understand, like, why do I like this? So and perception can be defined as like the process in which information is derived, like how are we understanding things? Through senses, organized and interpreted, it is an active process which takes place between the organism, us, and the environment. So do we like it? Cool. Why? How is our brains processing it? So, okay, then we start to say, how does this impact or influence my design thinking? Everyone has different landscape aesthetic preferences, right? Yeah. And then you start to say, well, why? That's your perception. So very loosely, using that term loosely. So I want to ask you a question. Here's 4 different scenes, A, B, C, and D. And even in the chat box, think about that, everybody. What's in your mind? Think about what's the one that you prefer the most. A, B, C, or D?
B.
Okay, let's ask this. How many of you, yeah, in the chat box, you can put your responses. How many in the room think A? Okay, what about B? Cool. C? There's, what about D? So vast majority of everybody here and what I'm seeing online responses is A. And guess what? I knew that was going to be the response. Oh, yeah, I should have had a slide that said this is what I hypothesized. And the one that had the least, I hypothesized that it was going to be D. And guess what? Did anybody vote D? Maybe one or two. I know there's a couple that did like, C. Yeah. And guess what? The reason that I suspected A is because there's a couple reasons. Color. Yeah. We know that color, even from a basic human instinct, provides interest. But also water. If we looked at 1,000 different landscapes and one had water, the ones that have water will have a higher level of preference. Why?
Basic need.
Basic need. It's a basic need. Survival. It's that basic need. In order for us to survive, we instinctively, it's like we're attracted to water because we have this instinct in the back of our head saying it's like, I need water and shelter and food to survive. But there's other reasons why A is more preferred. Who did not like D? Is there a reason why? Dark and creepy.
Bugs.
Bugs. It's a little more chaotic, maybe harder to interpret or see what's happening in the landscape. There's a reason for that. Basic needs, right? Survival. So we're seeing how landscape preference, even if we're just looking at these images, we're starting to see some type of trend, and that trend persists in our design decisions. So what we usually think of when we're thinking about landscape preferences and perceptions, what I'm trying to talk about is there's a way that we think about how do we like it? Because obviously we're not all choosing the same preferred landscape based off of a biological response. But there's more to it. So when we start to think about landscape preference and how do we understand it, we do have this evolutionary biological response that we know about. You know, we're actually trying to understand more. There's a lot of research that's going on with this. But then you have these different cultural influences. So when we think about the cultural influences, what have you done in your life? What are those social normative beliefs? What are all those different factors that influence your decision making that can then influence your landscape preference? So there's two different like mediating things that we can kind of say influence our why we like something. We may not always understand it, but these things exist. So, and when I talk about evolution and the biology, it's really cool. One way that we see this as an example in landscapes is with an image like this, the savanna. So there's a lot of research that's been done on understanding what is landscape preference. Globally, pretty much every time that this study is done, kids prefer this landscape. Unique. Doesn't matter where, or a landscape similar to it. Doesn't matter where you're at in the world, every single study, almost every single study, you're seeing this preference with youth. Well, but as we get older, more life experiences, we notice that those preferences change and are influenced. So we're seeing different landscapes that may have slightly different characteristics, but they may at this like look different, but in different contexts or the basic essentials of that landscape, we're going to start seeing an openness, maybe some water. We can see grand views, you know, something allows us to understand it, or it could be something mystical like this. I used AI to generate all these photos. So I was really excited. So this is like a fairy tale one. But anyways, But then, something more, again, this is AI generated, but put it from a local perspective. It's like how many people love the beach? There's the water. There's this open views. There's a little bit of mystery. What's over the sand dune that you might see? So that's where these different landscape theories come into play. Kind of understanding what is our preferences and perceptions, and kind of talking a little bit about that history of landscape understanding. And the three that we're going to go through is prospect refuge theory, plant blindness theory, as well as information processing theory. Information process theory is a really cool one, but it is the most boring name out of all three of these. So, because you're not going to get really excited when you read something about information process theory, that's for sure. But anyways, so let's talk a little bit about that prospect refuge. Prospect refuge, it's the idea of thinking about that basic safety and psychological needs. Think about early humans, gatherers and wanderers. The savanna-like landscape, not the savanna, but a savanna-like landscape consisting of low shrubs and clumps of trees divided by open space. Offers an attractive combination of prospect. I can see where I can go. I can see what's ahead of me, but at the same time, I have refuge, a place where I can feel safe and protected. So when I showed that photo of Central Park, some of you mentioned, oh, the shade in the tree. I want to kind of get along the edge and I can view outwards. Have you ever you step outwards of something and then all of a sudden you feel unbelievably uncomfortable because you're escaping that safety note? You're leaving that refuge. Same thing in a landscape. So we look at open spaces, we can see danger. It's harder for things to hide from us. We can see what's out ahead, but we can also see what resources are available to us in an open space. And the trees and shrubs are places to hide and feel safe or not be seen. To see yet not be seen. So here's some examples from some of one of the resources. This Conrad 1993. It's just someone's drawings from the research that they did. But we can look at things like strong refuge on the image on the far left. It's like a view. You're looking out in this landscape, but you feel like it has a pergola. You're on a patio. We call that like a strong refuge. You feel really protected. But then you have something like a prospect refuge balance. It's like you can see what's ahead of you very easily, and you have a little protection, and that little bit of protection is just provided by that canopy of the tree that you see poking into the corner. And then prospect is you're not necessarily having that refuge, but you can see what's ahead of you. So that's what prospect refuge theory is. Essentially is, think about all animals essentially. It's like, how can I see what's ahead of me yet still be protected? The next is plant blindness theory. So plant blindness is essentially how I say it's our brain just filtering plants out, because the theory is, I know master gardeners, you will see plants very quickly. That's what you do. But generally, it's the inability to notice plants in one's environment, recognize their importance or appreciate their unique biological features. So essentially, our brains filter out all the noise. So if we're walking through a landscape or we're just walking, there's a lot of stuff happening behind us, around us, cars driving, people talking. It might be breezy. You're not noticing yourself breathing. Your brain kind of filters out a lot of the stimulus. And then what ends up doing is that's where the plants, they're not necessarily something that we naturally perceive as a threat. So we have this plant blindness where our brain will naturally just want to filter out what we see in the landscape as plant material, unless you're specifically looking for it. Because the idea is plants don't hunt me, but animals do. Think about hunters gatherers. We're not the top of the food chain, from that perspective. There's a lot of things that would love to look at us and think that we're tasty. So we're trained to look for those threats. So plant blindness, we see plant blindness in modern era because I can't remember the stats on it, but when we think about endangered species, how many of you think of animals? Protecting endangered species animals, yeah. How many of you think about, Endangered Species Act, that includes plants as well? A handful. So majority of protection is to animals, but the plants can have more of a significant impact on maintaining ecosystem function than an animal will. So, but majority of protections on endangered species go to an animal, but not necessarily plants. Only a handful of plants are actually protected, yet there's a lot that are significantly threatened that can impact ecosystem function. So plant blindness is kind of that idea is like we naturally tend towards looking at animals. You know, I go to the zoo, I go look at animals. You know, but I don't know, sometimes I go to the zoo, I'm wanting to look at plants too. But nonetheless, it's like that's what we call plant blindness theory. So I wanted to try to see this. I want you to be as 100% honest as possible. 100% honest as possible, everybody. Is this going to be 100%? No, I tested it yesterday in the office. It was kind of fun because I just had the idea when I was trying to put this together. There's 6 photos that are about to pop up. And I want you to try to think, what's the first thing that you actually look at, that your mind goes to, okay? So like the minute that like all the images come up, what's the first thing you focus on? And don't be like, oh, I'm going to look for this. No, what's the first thing? Instinct, try your best. All right, you all ready? Okay. How many of you at first saw an animal? All right. How many of you first saw flowers? It's about 50-50. Hey, that's pretty good. Not too bad. So the idea is that when something pops up into our view, typically we're going to, from a biological response, look for what's considered a threat. But the milkweed is sure is pretty. So, but anyways.
You would have them placed differently.
Yeah, no, that was actually a discussion that we had.
From where I'm looking, the first thing I see the shark.
Mhm.
You know, you see the flowers and everything, but if you look at it, the first thing, had a flower been down there, would you have seen that first?
Yeah, I mean, it could have been. So this isn't a tested research method. This is just me just having an idea. Just curiousness. But I honestly was like, I wonder if there is a person, like maybe you flash 2 images really quickly. What's the first one you see? Maybe, I don't know.
It's so bright.
I know it grabs your eye. So maybe you have to be more specific in how you're choosing those images. But nonetheless, that was the idea. Try to see. But my curiousness. Thank you for coming to my experiment. It will not be published. All right. So information processing theory. So we talked about prospect refuge. We talked about plant blindness. But now there's information process theory. And this one is actually kind of a keystone in a lot of this research of understanding preference and perception. But essentially it comes down to how do we process, similar to prospect refuge. So information is derived through the contents and the organization of an environment. So there's a lot of stuff happening. How does our brain process all that stuff that's happening in a landscape? So if we understand our environment, we like it better. That's what it comes down to. If I perceive this and I understand it, I have a higher tendency to prefer it. How many of you love landscapes that have a little bit more order to them? Anybody love landscapes that is really messy? Oh man. Master gardeners all rose their hand. I love that. So but yes, on the general, it's like we love to have understanding of what a landscape looks like, or what our environment. We have to be able to process it. So when we look at this, is like if we understand our environment, we like it better. Landscapes should be what we call coherent, complex. Sometimes we don't think of complex and coherence, but you can have a coherent yet complex landscape. Something that's legible and mysterious. Yeah, ideally, we have all 4. If you achieve all 4 of those, you have the ability to have a landscape that's more preferred. And we see it time and time and time again that if we make sure that we're including coherence, complexity, legibility, and mystery in a landscape, more people are going to like it. We do that in landscape design urban design, any type of design, we actually use a lot of these as our understanding of how to put things together, how to use landscapes. So coherence really thinks about the order and organization. How does everything work together in relationship? So complexity, essentially, if there's more information that we can take in, it actually evokes exploration. It evokes movement. You know, think about a landscape. You want to try to get, sometimes you want people to stop. Sometimes you want people to kind of move through. And that complexity can help do that. Legibility. We can find our way around the landscape. We can feel safe. Like wayfinding. It's like, I know where to go and I know how to get there safely. So remember those 4 images, A, B, C, D, the one is just like the photo of the woods. There's a lot of like, it's dark. I don't really know what's out there. You know, it could be bugs. Like all of a sudden it's like, there's no legibility of that landscape or understanding. It's like, where do I go? Kind of feel stuck. So, but then mystery, it encourages exploration. You know, whenever I think about this, I sing that song from Disney's Pocahontas, Just Around the River Bend. You know, you don't know it's around the bend, but something is pulling you there. The part of like, what is that prospect of what is around the bend that I may see? So it encourages exploration. So it's part of the landscape isn't completely known. It's like, ooh, what's there? What can I go see? So we notice that if there's landscapes that have this coherence, complexity, legibility, and mystery, we have a more preferred landscape. So here is a photo. Another AI generated photo. We just got access to like a photo generator. So I've been enjoying it. Yeah. I don't have to pay for it, which is great. But anyway, so here's a landscape. Think about the coherence and the complexity. There's a lot of stuff in this landscape because there's like the ferns, there's grasses, there's trees, there's this fog, you know, but at the same time, it has a level of coherence to it. It's kind of whole, it all relates to one another. But then there's the mystery. Your eye followed that trail, right? Your eye followed that legibility. You see where to go. There's that wayfinding that helps move you through a landscape or help direct you where to go, whether you're moving or staying still. But then that fog ends up blocking your view and you're like, ooh, what's up through there? It kind of wants to pull you in, evoke a little bit of movement or exploration in the landscape. So here's just an image just highlighting those 4 factors of that information processing theory. So we look for the coherence and complexity. We love to have that mystery and make sure that it's legible. So we talked about these preferences and perceptions, understanding preference and perception. We have that prospect refuge theory. We have that plant blindness theory and information processing theory. Prospect refuge, again, the thinking is like, how do I feel safe, yet I can still see what's out ahead of me or what's around me? Essentially, don't be seen, but can see, relating to some of the dangers. Plant blindness is that the theory that says that, hey, we have a tendency to want to look more for what could be threats, not necessarily plant material. And we, you know, I didn't mention it, but we see a lot of time in like modern landscape design that there is a lot of plant blindness because we don't always look at the landscape and plants that are around us, and it does have an impact on even how people are designing spaces or interacting with them. But so we have plant blindness and then information processing, again, complexity, coherence, legibility, and that mystery. Those all have impacts, and all 3 of these are rooted in that biological evolutionary response to how we interact with our environments. So how do we process the information that's being put in front of us? So as that foundation, I want us to kind of look through how does this translate? Now, looking kind of like a brief history of time in our landscapes. We're going to kind of look at some of these periods. But anyways, so let's look at how we ended up where we are. So looking at the history of like our gardens, we can see these characteristics constantly prevail. So think about that early Neolithic period. Our wanderers, we started farming and agriculture. Of course, that popped up at separate times all over the world. It wasn't like just in Mesopotamia where we saw this occur, but we saw it happen in parts of Asia and even parts of North America enter this Neolithic period at slightly separate times. But anyways, the idea is our wanderers become villagers. So we have this Fertile Crescent. And then in this area, we have two major regions. We have Mesopotamia and Egypt, and the three major rivers. So we have the Nile, Euphrates, and Tigris. And it's kind of interesting because then it's like, okay, where is the earliest example of gardens that we have? Some of the earliest actual text that we have, it comes from a Sumerian poem from 2150 BC. And it says, now today throughout the whole world, kings of the land far and wide rejoice at Lord Ninurata. He provided water for the speckled barley in the cultivated fields. Survival, basic needs. All right. He piled up the harvest of fruits in gardens and orchard. So they're really thinking about how to the subsistence. So they're controlling the environment a little bit more. And then later on it says, let its meadows produce herbs for you. Let its slopes produce honey and wine for you. Let its hillsides grow cedars, cypress, juniper, and box for you. Let it make abundant for you ripe fruits as a garden. That's the earliest text that we have from a Sumerian poem talking about gardens. So it's really interesting because when we're looking at this, it's talking about how are we interacting with our environment. So we're starting to exhibit more control as part of that agriculture. So, but we're looking at it as like, you know, we have this water, these basic needs, the food, there's control. It creates these safer spaces from what we call would be the wild. So we start to see in these early times during the time of the Babylonians, as well as the Egyptians, we're starting to see productive gardens, but also we're starting to see walled gardens, refuge. We're creating these gardens that we can contain and stay within to protect us from the wilds outside of those spaces. So we also have the introduction of pleasure gardens. I don't know if anybody knows, do you know why we don't really see ziggurats, yet we still see pyramids? Pyramids are made from stone and ziggurats are primarily made from like mud and mortar. So they erode much quicker. So the more you know. Yeah. So, but anyway, so we start looking at this time, we have the Babylonians and their ziggurats, as well as the Egyptians, the pyramids. We're starting to see an introduction to gardens because what it does is it also creates the spaces of survival because of the basic residential landscape for those that were not the kings and the priests and whatever during that time. They were thinking production. I had my house, and in and around this little house that I lived in, I had a fence. And inside that fence, I had things that I was growing, cultivating, stronger control. So one of those gardens that we see is Senefer's garden in ancient Egypt, a giant garden that was enclosed by a wall, protect us from the wilds, providing refuge and prospect within one space. Starting to see, you know, this is similar to what we see now. Courtyard gardens, etc. A walled space, higher control. This is an example of we start to see in the Greeks and the Persians at the time. So we're starting to see way more control, maybe not as many walls, but we're still seeing very high productive gardens and residential landscapes. So it's really looking at the agriculture, but it's also peristyle courtyards. It's a walled space where we have much higher control over where we live. But they also, in the Greeks, they start to look at it differently from the wild of the landscape. They start having these sacred groves. So essentially these sacred groves are wooded areas, but that's where the gods lived. So not everybody would go into the woods, those wooded spaces, but you're starting to think sometimes when we see those wooded spaces, what could also be in that unknown, that mystery. But to them, we start to see this religion aspect come through with it. So it has that mystery invoked with that as a religion. So it's a place of God. It's where they dwell. So, and as well as the Persians, the Persians were like our first global empire of gardeners. Like they knew what to do. Like when we started looking at ornamental plants, the Persians had it under control. So they were the empire, great gardeners is sometimes what we call them. They had these big wall gardens. So similar to what we had previously with the Egyptians. But as well as they started looking at it also from a religious perspective also, and they called them the paradise gardens. So we started looking at the Persians. So we started thinking about the Islamic, Judaism, and Christian paradise garden, that Garden of Eden. The idea that these original paradisias, or these walled gardens, essentially were designed in this kind of the same layout of what we see in religious text for like the Garden of Eden, which is really cool. So they were mimicking religious text into their garden design. So they called them these paradise gardens. Really started with Cyrus the Great, or Cyrus the Great, and one of the oldest religions that we see globally in the world, with at least the Persians, we're seeing Zoroastrian, and that's these 4 quadrants that we see in a garden. In their gardens, these paradise gardens are referring to fire, air, earth, and water. So elements, but this no longer exists. It's just an open field, but there is remnants of it. It's kind of neat. So jump forward to the Roman Empire. A lot of Greek influence. So this is that Paris-style courtyard that we see in Romans. Influence heavily from the Greeks, but it's this enclosed courtyard where we have much higher control of what we're doing. Because outside of these walls are typically considered wild. There's threats. So we're trying to contain our environment within the safe confines of these walls and these spaces. So as growth occurred, as the Roman Empire expanded, they were really looking for a place for peace, calm, and tranquility. They wanted the world to kind of slow down. Sounds similar to our yards, right? Our goal is to go into our gardens and just hit the pause button a little bit. So when we look at these Paris-style courtyards, they're actually broken into like different parts. So this photo is being taken from what's called the Zeistis, which is the overlook. Kind of look, where do you stand and look over a garden? Some of these Paris-style courtyards were multiple, like around it, there's multiple floors. So it could be like a balcony looking down over the courtyard as well. So the ambulation is the actual garden space. So the idea of ambulation, the idea of amble, kind of walk through. And then the gestation is just the shaded area around the garden. So it's kind of like a colonnade that you're outside, your patio, essentially, being able to look out. You know, you have refuge from the weather and the storms, and you can still walk out into that controlled space. And also, we'll see this in public spaces as well. But then guess what? Rome fell. It sent Europe into chaos at the time. Now, the Byzantine Empire, like the Eastern Romans, were still doing all right for a little bit. But when at least we're looking at the rise of the Dark Ages, is the fall of the Roman Empire, the Eastern Roman Empire. So these Dark Ages, we're seeing mass migration throughout Europe. Okay, so resource uncertainty. You're looking at the basic needs, survival, you know, food, shelter, water, access. So we start to see these things, these wilds beyond the walls. Think of Dark Ages, those medieval castles, those fortification walls, and we can look outwards and see what's coming. And everything that's beyond that is these wilds. So we start to see outside these fortifications. Now, this is in France. I love this one because this is a great example. They can definitely see who's coming because it's just surrounded by water and a tiny little landmass that connects it to the mainland. And so what we're trying to see is we have these like cloister gardens that are still happening within these castles. But I always think of Monty Python and the Holy Grail. And like the very beginning of the movie when they are making their Trojan horse, which is the rabbit that they don't actually get into, but it's the castle. It's sitting there on the big, surrounded by that open area. Refuge of being within the walls of that fortification. And they actually would clear around all these castles to have openness, to have a better understanding and visual prospect of what's around them. Look for dangers. So the guy's up on the castle, you know, and he's hearing the chopping, the cutting, the chainsaw comes in, and then all of a sudden a rabbit comes out of the woods and approaches up to the castle. So that is essentially what we're seeing in a lot of these medieval castles, is a clearing that's around these buildings, and it's primarily for security. They also do it for agriculture, of course, but it's primarily for security, prospect refuge. So we did see a lot of rise of what we call the medieval cloister gardens. So they're typically associated with the church, but they're very similar to those peristyle courtyards. There's like an open space in the middle of these fortifications, these walled spaces, but they primarily use them for growing herbs or whatever it might be needed. And they usually just were green, typically just grass space, an open space that someone with a scythe would come in and cut, or they'd use livestock to nibble it back. Probably cows, not horses. Horses turn everything into mud. Cows nibble down. They're like the perfect lawnmower. But anyway, so those cloister gardens, they're very utilitarian at the time. But then all of a sudden it's like, okay, we have a little bit better order and structure in the environment now. So here we are, we fast forward to the Renaissance. So it really started in Italy. Merchants started spreading, merchants actually, a merchant, the Medici family is actually the family that kind of like, they were wealthy merchants. And essentially they started the Renaissance, what we think of as the Renaissance, because they started bringing in artists, poets, whatever it might have been. So they were heavily influenced by gardens at the time all around the world. But essentially what it started saying is like, hey, we're now at a time where we can have better control over nature and our environment. World's a little less chaotic. So they started turning, gardens turned outwards from cloisters, and there's a precedent of order and harmony. But the biggest thing is taming and controlling of nature. But it allows us to have a better understanding of how if we can maintain that structure and order, it allows us to have a better understanding of that landscape, and it's safe. So we started seeing the spread of the Renaissance, and it's initially started in Italy, but it then spread to like France and England as well. So like the English Renaissance gardens quickly became like influence of like Tudor gardens, but that's a different story for a different day. So then we have this, Renaissance gardens were known for the wealthy. And it's very high order. But then we had this guy named William Kent that said, you know what, let's think a little bit differently. And what he did is like all great designers do, they'll look at how we're doing things and then they'll be like, nah, let's do the complete opposite. And that's what he did. So essentially he said traditional gardens viewed landscapes as wild, controlling nature, taming nature, or nature is a threat, that environment's a threat, there's wilds beyond the wall. He's like, you know what? No, let's not do that. Let's do the separate. It's like, how about we show that we're living more in harmony, or we're part of the environment? Now, he didn't design that way per se, but he looked at Renaissance gardens controlled and dominated nature. So he created what we call the informal English garden. So he introduced things like meadows, pockets of trees, walking trails and paths. Like, here's a great example. This is one of William Kent's designs. Look very familiar. Starting to see a lot of these conditions and characteristics still, and that preference at the time has to do with like that, what's that savanna-like landscape, open meadows, connected spaces, place that you can have that prospect refuge. Here's another example of one of his gardens. Every square inch of that was designed. Like literally cut and fill, bringing in a bunch of soil. It wasn't just like, oh, here's a natural landscape, we make it look good. No, he destroyed the environment to make these. They look pretty, but like it was, when it comes to sustainability, that was not it. But there's still heavy control over the landscape, but we're seeing how the perspective shifts a little bit. So when we start to think about, okay, so we've had all this history of this world where we're starting to see how these gardens have changed and were influenced over time. And then we have this kind of birth of the lawns. So lawns existed. The term lawn is like a medieval Old English term for saying an open space in the woods. But lawn, now when we think about it, is that our front yard. So not always just turf grass, but turf grass is part of that lawn. So we look at colonial America at the time, we had this agrarian society. So kind of the idea of coming to the United States with manifest destiny with some of those early pioneers is control the wild, create this environment in which we can live. So we have high agrarian society at the time. So where they introduced Kentucky bluegrass for livestock because it's a wonderful forage. But then the English gardens we can think about broke up those formal gardens of the Renaissance and introduced informal English gardens, which created the first vision of modern lawns, those open spaces that were helping maintain manicure. But then the American landscape, It inspired two of America's most important landscape designers, which was mentioned earlier, who influenced the lawn use in America. George Washington and Thomas Jefferson. They were huge fans of that English style garden. Prior to this point, a lot of our gardens in the United States were influenced by those colonial countries. So like Netherlands, the French. So we can actually see all those different colonies and have different influences of what their gardens look like because they're bringing in those traditions from those gardens in those different countries, parts of the world. But they were heavily influenced by English gardens. They were a huge fan of William Kent, but also his protege, which we didn't talk about, named Capability Brown. He was a huge designer. So yes, question.
Well, part of it about Washington and Jefferson that I think is so cool is that they're building a country, but they're also taking a few minutes to check on their gardens and
Yeah.
because they got how good gardening is for the soul, and they always felt refreshed after
Yeah.
they worked in it or changed it in some way. They were out there gardening at the same time they're waging war and, writing the Declaration.
Exactly. I mean, you think about so up or online, it's like our founding fathers, you think they're pretty busy with other things, being presidents or, Revolutionary War, writing the Constitution, but they were avid gardeners. They were huge gardeners. I mean, you can still go to their homes now and you can see, I mean, it's maintained, but I mean, Thomas Jefferson, he had a garden. It's really cool. But I mean, here's an example. Here's Monticello, one of the views of Monticello. So we're seeing an actual this green open lawn. He wanted this open lawn in front of his landscape. It's part of this open view, helps kind of emphasize that the home, which we kind of still see today. But think about it. Refuge. A house, a refuge, and you have control of what's happening around you to allow you to interpret it. Prospect. But then lawns exploded in the United States. In the 19th century is really when it popularized, mainly because the unfortunate fact of this is how these were maintained: slaves. Indentured service, but that's how these were maintained. So it was honestly a social status thing. The only people who could have lawns were those that could have slaves, which is a very unfortunate thing, like I mentioned. But then it exploded because so much of our landscapes and our decision-making is social driven. Remember we mentioned that? Is those social influences. So it became a social status to have a lawn. So as social status, the invention of the lawnmower all of a sudden made it accessible once that was invented. But then the fastest growing sport at the time, golf, really pushed the direction of turfgrass use. And then as well as extension offices and garden clubs. It was the early 20th century or late 19th century. There's an article that came out it was like, if you are an American, you're going to have a lawn. It was like social status is like, if you are a real American, you are going to have a lawn. Or if you call yourself an American, you have to have a lawn. It's like, wow, okay. So it quickly exploded as a way for us. Is like, this is our cultural influence on our landscapes. It's like all of a sudden it's becoming a social thing. Now, landscapes in the Renaissance were very social because those who could afford it had a lot of money. Looking at early colonial Americas, those that could afford those large spaces that weren't just only productive, so non-agriculture, was a thing that was brought on by wealth. So all of a sudden, it became attainable, so it became a social status. Or we always say that keeping up with the Joneses. So, but there's a lot of different new philosophies on the lawn. So, lawns have been around. The idea of like these monoculture lawns didn't really actually pop up until like the latter half of the 20th century, because usually our lawns were just a composition of different plant material. But now we're looking at monocultures like all St. Augustine grass in your yard. But we're also seeing a shift in these mentality or what a lawn is. So we're seeing a lot of changes into what lawns. It's no longer just a monoculture. They polyculture, so multiple grass species, or if it's like, if you're like me, if it's green and grows and you can mow it, looks good, and you don't get in trouble by the HOA, you're all right, you know? But I mean, even like that, when I mentioned like HOA, social driven. So we're now moving, we have moved in this transect as a time is like, we're just looking at survival responses. You know, there's still some of those influences, but our survival response is now shifting from, I don't want to get eaten, to all of a sudden it's like, now we're looking at the social change. So we're seeing a lot of those cultural influences really pushing what does a landscape look like, but all rooted in that basic biology and evolution. So, and then that's ultimately like how we got here. So we're looking at this photo again. When we think about our landscapes, our homes, think about as that refuge, that place that we have the ability to live, feel safe, be safe, prospect. How do we maintain our lawns and our landscape around us so we have a better understanding of what's occurring? You know, but then it's like, is there that mystery, that complexity, that coherence? Is it legible? So we're starting to see that despite what's going on, you know, culturally, it's like our landscapes still kind of are still following a lot of those basic evolution and psychological needs. So when we start thinking, it's like, why do landscapes look this way? It's not necessarily just because we decided one day that this is going to be the way they look. It's to a certain instance, we are actually making decisions that are being influenced by something happening in our brain that we have no control over. It's just kind of like, it's just there, but it can be filtered through that cultural and social norms or those cultural influence on what landscape preference could be. So when our landscapes, when we're thinking about how do we change and shift landscapes, we look at these different theories of like, what are preferences? And then, or what are these preferences and perceptions, and how does that influence our decision making? So when we're looking at residential landscapes, whether we're making those decisions in our yards for our personal preference, or if we're having to make decisions that have community-wide impacts, the landscape, the part that we see that's that unseen landscape is the stuff that's influencing our decision making that we may not even be aware of at all. And that's what that unseen landscape is. So, any questions? This isn't your typical Landscape Matters program. So is there any questions from anybody online? And we can click on some of the lights if you'd like, just to get some more light into here. Yes.
But when did botanical gardens get started?
So when did botanical gardens get started? That's a very good question, because when we start looking at when we're calling it botanical gardens, probably popped up more around the time of the Renaissance, because during that Renaissance period, we're seeing a huge amount of trade of plant material during that period. But we're also seeing a lot of that in the Roman Empire during the Roman and Greeks. So starts with a P. I cannot remember his name, but he's Greek, but he talks a lot about ornamental plants. But when we actually think about botanical gardens, like the idea of plant collections for demonstration or showing, we actually still see, even though we weren't called botanical gardens, but we're still seeing those influences all the way back to the early Egyptians as well as the Persians. So yeah, when we think about ornamental landscapes, even though during years and years ago, it was predominantly just basic needs and survival, but there was still that heavy cultivation and collection of plants that were occurring at the time.
Have, I guess, an observation that I've noticed as I've gone through the Master Gardener program and learned more about plants and the purpose of plants, as opposed to maybe the way I used to think about plants as more just pretty, something pretty to look at. But I noticed that as you learn more about plants and do maybe a deeper dive, that liking, because what I noticed from a lot of the people in here, Master Gardeners, when I go see their gardens, they're a lot, I guess, messier. And there's more of an appreciation of nature and that purpose. Whereas I think for the typical person, they like this type of look. And I just noticed that evolution, even in my own mind, I used to like more of this look when I first had a house. But now I like a bit messier look. You know, I don't mind some weeds and things like that, and actually see a purpose for maybe those types of things if they bring in pollinators. So do you have any commentary on how the brain shifts? Does it just,
So how does the brain
Develop
shift? So it's like at one time you liked one landscape and now
Yeah.
you like the other. It's like we have this rooted history, but it's like, why do we end up making that transition, right?
yes,
So yeah, so the transition really comes down to going back to that slide towards the beginning is our landscape preferences. We have this biologic and evolutionary response. We also have these cultural responses as well. So when we start looking at those social norms, normative or what we call normative beliefs shift consistently through our lifetime. As we learn more information or as our environment or our social network changes, therefore that norm, as that norm shifts, so does our decision making. So that's where that some of those biggest influences are, is just you start introducing yourself to this world. And so your personal norm or how you interpret the world is starting to shift as well. So therefore your preferences can change just because that input is shifting a little bit as well.
Because you got a deeper understanding of your.
Yeah, so it could be because there's a deeper understanding of your environment, but the understanding of an attitudes toward environment isn't necessarily indicative of our decision making and behavior. It could literally just be, here's my group of friends, this is what they do, therefore this is what I do too. It can be as simple as that. In the back.
Also, you might watch the Nassau, some higher up you go, once you hear about, you don't have somebody.
Yeah.
To conform. So that would be kind of.
That's a really great point, is that you can tie it back to that Maslow's hierarchy of needs. Is once you're higher at that point, once you're higher towards that self-actualization, you may have less desire to fulfill maybe those societal needs because you feel like you're at a capacity that you can do what you really want to do, or you can strip away maybe some of those norms. That's a very great insight.
If you're volunteering and doing a lot of other stuff, you just may not have time.
Yeah. Or if you're volunteering a lot, it's like you just may not have time. Yeah. There's a lot of times we say,
You'll still be there.
yeah. At that point, that we may be, that could have been a weed 3 weeks ago, and you're like, oh, now it looks good, so it can stay. Yeah. So, but that's another good, another good observation, because then when we start talking about behavior, we talk about where the barriers of behavior. So time is a barrier to behavior. So it could be, well, maybe I want to do this, but I just can't, because I have other things that have higher priority, so I don't have time that I can provide to this to achieve that certain goal. So I loved those questions. That was great. All right, is there any other questions or any questions from anybody online? Wonderful. Well, it's 11:02. I want to thank everybody for coming. We do have the sign-in sheet around. Try to make sure if you haven't signed in that you do sign up or sign in. And next month, our presentation is going to be all about flowers, and it's on May 8th, second Wednesday of every month. But it's the Wednesday before our Master Gardener Volunteer plant sale. So of course, we're going to be highlighting some of the plants we're going to be selling on May 11th at our plant sale. So feel free to stop by next month. We're at our Minor Road office, so in Yulee. And thank you all for joining us online. And I'll make sure I try to get copies of this out to everybody in the next week or so. So thank you all so much. And thank you all for joining us online.
Taylor, the sign-in sheet is up by you.
Perfect. Oh, it is?
Yeah,
It's right
right behind.
behind the.
Oh,
But I think.
oh, we actually have one.
Sherry, I think Sherry.
Yeah, Karen, no, I didn't realize we actually have one. You're so prepared. Oh.
Are they valuable?
Yeah.
But I brought some, I don't know.
That's sweet.
Some of these things.
I'm sorry.
No, I gotta sign it. I just have 3 of them, but this one is a tree, and I took pictures as well. And it's become a tree, and there are